One star was banned by the U.S. Senate for a love affair, another was blacklisted by the government for his political beliefs, and a third was literally erased from her films for daring to be a black woman in a leading role. This isn't a history of tragedy, it's a history of betrayal. We're pulling back the curtain on the industry's unspoken crimes against its most luminous talent. The siren whose voice faded, Clara Bow. She was the blazing, beautiful it girl who defined the very energy of the 1920s. Look closely at her smile. Beneath the flapper abandon and the cinematic sparkle, there was a terrified young woman being devoured by the Hollywood machine. She was the single biggest movie star on Earth, generating tens of millions in box office revenue for Paramount. How did the most famous star on Earth become the unmentionable girl almost overnight? Clara Bow, an orphan from Brooklyn, arrived in Hollywood with a raw, undeniable vitality that leapt off the screen. She single-handedly embodied the jazz age, becoming Paramount Pictures' biggest box office draw. Her face was everywhere, her style imitated globally, and her films delivered staggering profits. Yet the price of this global fame was the complete destruction of her privacy and the relentless exploitation of her image. Paramount treated their biggest asset not as an artist, but as a commodity. Her grueling contract demanded non-stop production, sometimes as many as 4 major features a year, totaling 58 films, allowing no time for rest or personal life. The studio, to maintain her it girl persona, encouraged a chaotic social life, which the sensationalized gossip press then weaponized against her. When the pressures of fame and exploitation led to mental health struggles, the studio offered no compassion. Instead, they framed her vulnerability as a lack of professional stability. Her very human reactions to immense stress were spun by publicists into stories of erratic behavior, systematically undermining her trust with the audience. The final blow came with a brutal public campaign of character slander waged by an unscrupulous former business associate who fabricated outlandish stories about her private life. While the accusations were proven false in court, the reputational harm was catastrophic. The studios, fearful of controversy, decided she was simply too much trouble for the bottom line. In 1933, at the heartbreakingly young age of 28, Clara Bow was forced into retirement. Exhausted physically and emotionally, her career was ended by the very industry she had made rich. Paramount quickly shifted focus to their next bright star, actively downplaying her legacy and removing her name from promotional materials. The siren's voice was fading, silenced by exhaustion and malicious gossip. The irony is haunting. The woman who taught America how to live with abandon was forced into seclusion. The erasure of Clara Bow showed how quickly the spotlight could be turned off. But the next erasure was even more swift and total, triggered by a party that became a national scandal. The scandal that sank a legend, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. Look at these headlines from 1921. They are a shriek of moral panic, permanently staining the biggest star of the silent era. One party, 3 agonizing trials, and the permanent end of one of cinema's most beloved comedians. Was this justice, or the most effective character slander ever executed by Hollywood's moral watchdogs? Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was, quite simply, comedy royalty. His films generated millions of dollars for Paramount, and he was the first male star in Hollywood to command a $1 million contract. His jovial, childlike presence on screen was a beloved staple. This immense popularity, however, made him a massive target when Hollywood desperately needed a public sacrifice to save its own reputation. The tragedy began with a private party in San Francisco in September 1921. Following the tragic passing of a young actress, Arbuckle was quickly and sensationally accused of a heinous crime. The press, then entirely unregulated and eager for sensationalism, bypassed any presumption of innocence. Newspapers printed lurid, fabricated details, painting Arbuckle as a depraved monster. The public, fueled by this stream of false accounts, turned against him overnight. The resulting 3 trials became a media circus. Despite the lack of credible evidence and the eventual unanimous acquittal, where the jury formally apologized for the injustice he suffered, the studio system had already made its decision. The moral watchdogs, already suspicious of Hollywood's perceived decadence, saw Arbuckle's fall as a powerful tool. The powerful studio system, spearheaded by figures like Will H. Hayes, moved with stunning speed to enforce a total blacklisting. The Hayes office, which would soon become the industry's moral police, used Arbuckle as a scapegoat to prove its seriousness. They declared his films obscene and pulled them from circulation, permanently banning him from appearing on screen. Despite his legal exoneration, the moral court of Hollywood deemed him permanently unemployable. This wasn't just a career setback, it was the systematic eradication of his cinematic legacy. Arbuckle's subsequent attempts at a comeback were agonizingly short-lived. He tried directing under the pseudonym William Goodrich, but the public relations stain was indelible. The studios, afraid of the political power of the outrage groups, made sure that Roscoe Arbuckle, the star, ceased to exist. His films were destroyed, his name erased, and his comedic genius was left to languish in obscurity. Roscoe Arbuckle's story is the definitive example of how Hollywood's unchecked power could execute a complete, intentional erasure. The star was acquitted, but the studio's verdict of social unacceptability stood firm. This brutal cleansing showed that the studio would sacrifice any star to protect its own image. But for our next star, the erasure was not due to scandal, but due to the color of her skin. Dorothy Dandridge, The Cost of Breaking Barriers. Look at her radiant smile on that historic night in 1955. She was the first black woman nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. Yet, after reaching the absolute peak of her profession, Hollywood systematically forgot her name. What was the true cost of breaking cinema's color barrier? Dorothy Dandridge was a performer of incandescent talent. Her breathtaking performance in the 1954 film Carmen Jones should have launched her into the stratosphere of leading ladies. The world saw a superstar, but the studio system saw a problem that challenged the deep-seated racial bias of the time. Following her Oscar nomination, the doors that should have flown open remained stubbornly shut. Hollywood, entrenched in its rigid hierarchy, was unwilling to accept a black woman in a role that transcended the limited, stereotypical parts, maids, domestics, or tragic figures, it usually reserved for actors of color. Despite her established box office appeal, major studios refused to cast her in leading roles opposite white male stars, fearing the backlash from theaters in the South and from powerful, conservative organizations. Her contractual restrictions were severe, effectively limiting her to roles that reinforced the prejudiced expectations of the time. She desperately yearned for complex, romantic roles, but was repeatedly forced into films that demeaned her craft. The pressure was relentless and cruel. She was offered projects designed to exploit her beauty while restricting her dramatic opportunities. Her brilliance was channeled into films that ultimately minimized her impact, slowly eroding her cinematic presence. This was an erasure not of scandal, but of opportunity. The system simply chose to look past her extraordinary talent because of the color of her skin. The studios compounded this cruelty with financial exploitation. Her pay for major roles lagged significantly behind her white counterparts. For example, an established white star with her box office record could expect to earn 30% to 50% more per major film role than she was paid. This systemic denial of career advancement and financial parity led to a mounting sense of desperation. The tragic circumstances of her untimely passing in 1965
were immediately framed by the press as a consequence of her own personal fragility. The studio narrative focused on her emotional burdens, conveniently distracting attention from the true villain. The discriminatory system that systematically denied her the roles, the respect, and the financial freedom she had earned. Dorothy Dandridge's legacy is the heartbreaking story of a barrier shattered by talent, only to have the pieces meticulously gathered up and put back in place by a
fearful, unethical industry. Next, we explore another female star whose brilliance was met with the blunt force of moral censorship. The Code versus the Queen, the double life of Mae West. Listen to this line. Is that a gun in your pocket, or are you just glad to see me? She was too witty, too alluring, and far too smart for the moral watchdogs of the 1930s. This is the story of a formidable woman who built an empire on audacious charm, and the deliberate, relentless attempt by the Hays Code to neuter her unique persona. Mae West arrived in Hollywood already a veteran of the stage and a writer of her own material, a level of creative control that made her an immediate anomaly. She understood the power of innuendo. Her first few films were massive successes for Paramount, turning her into one of the highest-paid women in America. Her 1933 film, I'm No Angel.
So it's you. I suppose you know why I'm here. Hardly. You see, I'm a lion tamer, not a mind reader.
Was so profitable, it single-handedly saved Paramount from bankruptcy, earning over $2 million domestically. However, the immense financial success of her sophisticated brand of allure was immediately seen as a threat to the nation's moral structure. The newly empowered Production Code Administration, the Hays Office, was established in 1934 with the explicit mandate to enforce strict moral guidelines. Mae West became their primary target. The censors were relentless, scrutinizing every single word she wrote and every gesture she made. They demanded the removal of entire scenes, the alteration of her most clever double entendres, and the softening of her entire defiant on-screen attitude. Her lines were sanitized, her costumes were buttoned up, and the very essence of her provocative wit was systematically diluted. The studios, fearful of the Hays Office's power to completely ban their films, became complicit in this censorship. They pressured Mae West to conform, attempting to control her creative process and reduce her to a passive player. They tried to pair her with younger, less dynamic male leads, hoping to dull her commanding presence. Despite this focused, institutional effort to censor, Mae West continued to fight. She would often submit intentionally outrageous scripts, knowing the censors would focus on those elements and allow her to slip slightly milder, yet still suggestive material into the final version. It was a constant, tiring battle of wits. Ultimately, the pressure and the constant dilution of her unique appeal took their toll. As the 1930s wore on, the censors finally succeeded in making her films too bland for her once ardent fans. Her later career lull, often blamed by the studio on changing tastes, was in fact the direct consequence of the censors having finally won their decade-long campaign of attrition. Mae West's story is a profound lesson in institutional censorship, an attempt to erase a massive star not by scandal, but by systematic suppression of her genius. But the next erasure was permanent, a tragedy shrouded in a silence the studio was eager to enforce. The mystery of Thelma Todd's final scene. Look closely at this photograph. A beautiful blonde comedienne found in her car in a garage in 1935. Was it self-inflicted harm, accident, or a heinous assault? The truth of Thelma Todd's shocking passing remains shrouded in confusion, thanks largely to the studio's intense eagerness to sweep her demise under the rug. Thelma Todd possessed a sparkling, effervescent screen presence that made her one of the most delightful comediennes of the early sound era, co-starring with giants like the Marx Brothers and Laurel and Hardy. Yet, away from the camera, Thelma was an independent spirit, a trait that put her at odds with the all-consuming studio system. The trouble began with her growing refusal to sign a restrictive long-term contract. Thelma desired creative and financial autonomy, aiming to manage her own career and her popular seaside cafe. This independence was viewed by powerful studio heads as a dangerous act of defiance. Her refusal created immediate friction with influential figures, including some with rumored connections to organized crime. The final scene of her life began on a Sunday evening in December 1935. The next morning, Thelma was found slumped over in the front seat of her convertible, which was parked in the garage adjacent to her cafe. The initial reports were confused and contradictory. The official finding was passing due to carbon monoxide poisoning, a rapid and seemingly rushed conclusion. Crucially, the car's ignition was off and the tank was nearly full, contradicting the theory of extended running time. The studio's immediate public reaction was one of clinical expediency. They issued confusing statements, often downplaying her connections to powerful, shadowy figures she was rumored to have been arguing with just hours before. The speed with which the studio and the local authorities closed the case raised numerous eyebrows. The unsettling rumors of foul play persisted, fueled by Thelma's recent conflicts and the unusual circumstances of her final moments. Many believed her independence, particularly her refusal to allow certain individuals to use her successful cafe for illicit activities, had made her a target of menace. The studio, fearing a deeper investigation that might expose the darker ties of Hollywood, ensured the narrative remained closed and controlled. Thelma Todd's light was extinguished tragically and unjustly. The studio's swift, intense public relations effort to erase the mystery was an act of institutional self-preservation. It guaranteed that a beloved star became a tragic footnote, her legacy forever overshadowed by an unsolved, heartbreaking question. Her mystery was silenced by power. Our next star's legacy was silenced by the rigid moral code surrounding his private life. Ramon Novarro, the quiet tragedy of a matinee idol. Look at this image of two titans, Ramon Novarro
and Rudolph Valentino. Both were Latin lovers who defined romance for a generation. Why does only one of these cinematic heartthrobs remain in Hollywood lore? The tragic price of a hidden identity. In the studio system's morally rigid world, erased the memory of Ramon Novarro. Ramon Novarro was the quintessential romantic star of the 1920s, commanding immense popularity in both the silent and early sound eras. Following the untimely passing of Valentino, Novarro became the industry's undisputed king of romance. Yet this public image was a carefully constructed facade designed by the all-powerful Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer (MGM) studio. Novarro was a gentleman whose private romantic preferences were not aligned with the acceptable public morality of the studio system. In that rigidly conservative era, the studios demanded that their male leads project an image of impeccable heterosexual virtue. Novarro's immense popularity was thus conditional upon his complete concealment of his true identity. The studio went to extraordinary lengths to maintain this deception. They orchestrated and publicized a fake romantic relationship with fellow actress Renée Adoré, creating staged photographs and circulating fabricated stories of their supposed courtship. Novarro's life became a terrifying exercise in duplicity, forcing him to live every day in fear that his truth would be exposed. Despite his immense box office appeal, the pressure of maintaining this double life began to affect his health and his career choices. He yearned for authentic connection, but was perpetually trapped by his contract and the studio's pervasive surveillance. His talent was undeniable, but his happiness was strictly forbidden. As the years passed, Novarro was gradually marginalized by the studios, deemed too difficult to manage, or simply too great a risk. The studio system, having used his talent, allowed his star to fade from the public eye. The final, devastating act of erasure came in 1968. Novarro suffered a profoundly violent attack at his home in Laurel Canyon, an event that led to his brutal passing. The studios, rather than addressing the harrowing circumstances, immediately worked to downplay and sanitize the reporting. The media was discouraged from delving into the details, and his magnificent career was tragically overshadowed by the circumstances of his demise. Ramon Novarro's story is a heartbreaking illustration of how the studio system's moral rigidity could cause great suffering to its own stars, ultimately silencing a brilliant talent whose only fault was failing to conform. We move now from the moral code of the bedroom to the political purges of the studio boardroom, where the weapon of choice was ideology. The voice silenced by fear, Paul Robeson. Listen to that magnificent voice.
Sandy the strong, Sandy the wise, righter of wrong.
It belonged to a giant of the stage and screen, a Yale-educated scholar, and a global cultural icon. Yet in the 1950s, his only crime was having an opinion. How did the American government, working alongside the Hollywood studios, execute a total systemic erasure of Paul Robeson? Paul Robeson was a figure of towering talent and uncompromising conviction. He was an outspoken supporter of civil rights and an adherent of socialist causes, believing deeply in the rights of the working class. In the escalating paranoia of the Cold War, this conviction made him a dangerous, unacceptable figure. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, and other government agencies launched a coordinated campaign against him, declaring him an enemy of the state. The first and most devastating blow came when the U.S. State Department revoked his passport in 1950, effectively trapping him within the borders of a country that had declared his very identity suspect. With Robeson unable to travel to perform in Europe, where he was immensely popular and highly paid, the Hollywood studio system and the recording industry finished the job. Fearful of incurring the wrath of HUAC, the studios immediately and totally blacklisted him. Contracts were voided. Films he had already made were either pulled from circulation or edited, and recording companies stopped distributing his music. This blacklisting and passport revocation cost him an estimated $1.5 million in performance income over 8 years. This was not a scandal-driven erasure. It was an ideological purge. The studio's active compliance was a deliberate attempt to delete a prominent voice from the American cultural landscape. They viewed Robeson's activism as a toxic liability, ensuring that his powerful screen presence and influential music were systematically removed from American circulation, effectively making him invisible. Robeson spent 8 agonizing years unable to perform globally, his tremendous talent wasted due to government and industry collusion. The tremendous financial and emotional toll led to severe health struggles. The narrative pushed by the major studios was one of public controversy, masking the reality that they were actively aiding the government's efforts to silence a voice of dissent. Paul Robeson's legacy survives today only through the passionate dedication of historians and archivists.
His story stands as a frightening monument to the power of the state and the complicity of the studios in enacting a cultural cleansing. But Robeson was not the only talent to be banished for her beliefs. Hollywood's other communist, Gale Sondergaard. Look at her elegant, controlled expression as she accepts the first ever Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. Gale Sondergaard was at the pinnacle of her craft, yet she became the first Oscar winner to be completely, unforgivably banished by Hollywood's notorious blacklist. Gale Sondergaard was a formidable talent whose sophisticated intensity made her a sought-after character actress. Her performances were marked by an intellectual depth, culminating in her
historic win for Anthony Adverse in 1936. However, Sondergaard was married to director Herbert Biberman, a man who became one of the infamous Hollywood 10, a group of writers and directors who refused to cooperate with HUAC in 1947. In the paranoid climate of the Cold War, the studio system viewed association with anyone suspected of holding subversive opinions as a catastrophic liability. Sondergaard's career collapse was immediate, total, and brutal. She had committed no crime, yet she was judged guilty by association. The blacklist was a powerful, informal mechanism of economic control, and when the studios learned of her husband's refusal to name names, they instantly erased her from their roles. Her existing contracts were voided, and her name was subtly removed from casting consideration. Her steadfast refusal to condemn her husband or to betray her colleagues sealed her fate. For this loyalty, the studios condemned her to professional anonymity. This was a devastating punishment for an actress in her prime. The resulting professional gap was agonizing: 20 years. For 2 decades, a brilliant, Oscar-winning actress was deemed unemployable in her own country. Her earlier work was rarely screened, creating a generation of filmgoers who simply did not know her name. This was a deliberate act of cultural concealment. She and her husband were forced to leave the country for a period, seeking work where political intolerance did not dictate casting choices. When she finally was able to return and find minor work in the 1970s, the continuity of her career had been shattered beyond repair. Gale Sondergaard's story is the perfect example of the blacklist's institutional power. It was a tool of ideological erasure, demonstrating that loyalty and principle were considered greater threats than any artistic failure. This concludes Part 2, covering stars targeted for ideology. You must not miss the next phase of erasure, which involved industry sabotage and cruel control over an actor's personal life. Shelley Winters, The Price of Being Difficult. She was a force of nature, known for her powerful performances and her absolute refusal to be a Hollywood doll. They labeled her difficult and, in a calculated act of industry payback, put her career on ice. What was the true price of an outspoken woman's integrity in an era that demanded docility? Shelley Winters quickly proved herself to be an actress of immense depth and volatility. She was a magnetic presence on screen and commanded respect. Off-screen, however, her honesty and her principled refusal to adhere to the studio's expectations of a quiet, compliant starlet made her a major problem. The studio system demanded that female stars be beautiful, agreeable, and above all, silent on matters of business. Shelley Winters was none of these things. She was fiercely outspoken about women's rights, equal pay, and the often biased nature of casting and contracts. She refused to conform to the narrow ingenue stereotype. This passion was immediately weaponized against her. The studios began a sustained campaign to malign her professional reputation. Her outspokenness was systematically framed as instability, and her commitment to quality was twisted into a lack of professionalism. The term difficult, often a veiled accusation of independence, was constantly circulated. The consequence was a predictable, chilling pattern of career sabotage. She found major roles suddenly unavailable. Directors and producers were subtly warned away from casting her, being told she would cause trouble. This was the studio's method of putting her career on ice, a systematic cooling of opportunities designed to force her compliance. Shelley Winters was forced to spend long, frustrating periods in the 1950s, accepting smaller, less glamorous character roles, parts where her outspokenness posed less of a financial risk. She was a two-time Academy Award winner, yet her career trajectory was consistently hampered by the studio's desire to punish her independence. Shelley Winters' refusal to be a quiet victim makes her story a powerful testament to the price of integrity. Her career survived because of her sheer talent and persistence, but it was constantly undermined by a manufactured narrative of chaos. The original crossover. Sessue Hayakawa's Ghost. Look at the power and sophistication in this image of Sessue Hayakawa. Before Jackie Chan, before Ken Watanabe, there was the world's first Asian movie star, a romantic idol whose fame rivaled Douglas Fairbanks. Yet this Japanese superstar Hollywood couldn't control, or keep, was actively ignored, and his legacy allowed to disappear. Sessue Hayakawa was a phenomenon of the silent era. He was a major leading man, known for his intense magnetism. His 1915 film, The Cheat, made him an international superstar, and he became one of the highest-paid actors of the 19-teens, earning a reported $5,000 a week. He even established his own production company. However, Hayakawa's career soon became a tragic victim of deeply rooted prejudice and xenophobia. Despite his talent, studios refused to cast him in complex, romantic leading roles opposite white actresses. Instead, he was perpetually forced into playing villains or antagonists, a subtle but persistent attempt to limit his appeal and reinforce existing stereotypes. Frustrated by the rigid, discriminatory roles, Hayakawa made the bold decision to leave the suffocating constraints of Hollywood. He spent years working successfully in Europe. This move was viewed by Hollywood as an act of professional disloyalty. When the 1940s arrived, the outbreak of World War II became the final, brutal act of erasure. American xenophobia against Japanese culture intensified, and the studios actively ignored or suppressed Hayakawa's earlier cinematic achievements. His films were rarely screened, and his immense fame was quietly removed from the narrative of early Hollywood success. It wasn't until decades later, with his powerful Oscar-nominated return performance in The Bridge on the River Kwai in 1957, that a new generation rediscovered his brilliance. But the years of active suppression, driven by bias and wartime hysteria, had turned a global superstar into a ghost in his own industry's history. Sessue Hayakawa's Ghost reminds us that talent alone was often insufficient protection against the brutal forces of societal bias and corporate fear. Our next star faced an erasure fueled by systemic financial exploitation and a narrative of manufactured fragility. Judy Garland, the final act of studio control. She was the little girl with the perfect voice, beloved by the world since she skipped down the yellow brick road. But the studio owned her since she was a girl, controlling her diet, her sleep, and her very spirit. The final erasure was erasing her peace, painting her as a fragile tragedy to distract from the systemic abuse. Judy Garland's relationship with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM, began when she was just 13 years old. Her youth and her enormous value to the studio made her a target for relentless corporate control. MGM's control was a form of systemic exploitation, both physical and psychological. To maintain her high-energy performance schedule and her youthful figure, the studio put her on a punishing regimen. This included unregulated appetite suppressants and sleep-restricting stimulants, administered by studio-affiliated doctors who prioritized production schedules over the patient's well-being. She was essentially kept in a state of perpetual, chemically induced wakefulness and hunger. The sheer volume of work demanded was inhumane. When her body and mind inevitably began to show signs of strain, the studio did not offer treatment. They offered more substances and more control. Her financial exploitation was equally devastating. As she matured, her struggles became impossible to hide. The studio's response was a brilliant, brutal act of public relations erasure. They actively created and promoted the narrative that Judy Garland was a fragile tragedy, a sensitive artist whose emotional instability was the source of her career struggles. This public narrative served a dual purpose for MGM. It excused the production delays caused by her health crises, and most importantly, it distracted attention from the systemic abuse and the reckless medical mismanagement orchestrated by the studio itself. Her personal struggles were framed as a flaw of character, not a consequence of corporate demand. The final, heartbreaking act of control was the forced severance of her contract in 1950, carried out under a cloud of bad press. By controlling her career, her body, and finally the public perception of her emotional life, the studio managed to erase the evidence of their own misconduct. Judy Garland's story is the definitive case of Hollywood's ability to crush the spirit of its most luminous star. The ultimate tragedy was the fact that the studio never allowed her a moment of peace. How gossip pages buried Kim Novak. Look at her, blonde, glacial, and intensely private. She was Alfred Hitchcock's ultimate muse. Yet, when she sought a life outside the relentless Hollywood spotlight, the media weaponized her mental health. How did the gossip pages frame her desire for privacy as a symptom of instability? Kim Novak achieved global fame almost instantly after her spectacular rise to stardom in the mid-1950s. Columbia Pictures, which held her ironclad contract, molded her meticulously into a stunning screen idol. But her sensitivity and her deep longing for a life away from the studio's suffocating control were always at odds with the demands of fame. Novak was not a product of the Hollywood machinery. She was an artist who enjoyed painting and craved the serenity of a private existence. When her contract allowed, she began to move away from the glare of Los Angeles to nurture her private life. This desire for autonomy and quiet was seen by the studio and the press not as a healthy choice, but as a direct affront to her stardom. The studio, eager to force its valuable asset back into the relentless cycle of publicity, began to feed subtle, undermining stories to the powerful tabloid press. The narrative was calculated and cruel. Her desire for privacy was framed as eccentricity, and her simple need for rest was inflated into unstable behavior. The weaponization of her mental health was the ultimate tool of erasure. By framing her desire for quiet reflection as a sign of professional madness or instability, the media was effectively working in concert with the studio to discourage her independence. The implication was clear. A major star who rejected the fame machine must be flawed. The result was a deliberate cooling of her career. Though she continued to work, the persistent negative buzz, all manufactured to punish her move toward privacy, made her a less attractive prospect for major studios. She became associated with the narrative of being difficult or unpredictable. Kim Novak's story is a chilling reminder that the relentless, invasive scrutiny of the media was a powerful secondary weapon of the studio system. They used the press to punish and erase those who dared to draw a boundary between their public image and their private well-being. Ingrid Bergman, the Purity Clause. Look at this image. Ingrid Bergman, radiant on the night of an Oscar win. Now look at the headlines that followed just a few years later. The United States Senate floor condemned her, and the studios attempted to remove her from American cinema. This is the shocking story of how a private indiscretion became a public witch hunt, orchestrated by powerful moralists. Ingrid Bergman was the epitome of grace and sincerity, an actress whose reputation was carefully curated as wholesome virtue. Her performances in classics like Casablanca and Gaslight made her one of the most beloved and trusted figures in American cinema. The shattering incident occurred in 1949. Bergman, married at the time, fell deeply in love with the renowned Italian director Roberto Rossellini while collaborating on the film Stromboli. Her subsequent affair and the news of her resulting pregnancy sent a shockwave of moral outrage through conservative America. The reaction was unprecedented. Bergman became the target of a national, furious media attack. Religious and civic groups launched boycotts of her films, and in an astonishing display of government overreach, her behavior was denounced on the floor of the United States Senate by a senator who labeled her a powerful influence for evil. The American studio's response was one of immediate, calculated self-preservation. Fearful of the intense backlash, they collectively decided to blacklist her. Major production houses refused to offer her work, effectively cutting off her career in Hollywood. This was a deliberate act of professional banishment, designed to placate the outrage. Bergman was forced to leave the United States for 7 agonizing years, finding cinematic refuge in Italy and Europe, where her talent was judged by artistic merit. The American studios allowed her legacy to fade, rarely re-releasing her films and omitting her name from promotional material. This attempt at erasure proved the hypocrisy of the studio system. They were willing to overlook nearly any private vice if it could be kept secret, but a public display of nonconformity to the moral code by a powerful woman was an unforgivable offense. The silence around Hattie McDaniel's stolen moment. Look at this historic photograph. The first black person to win an Academy Award, holding her golden statue. Yet, the system made sure that Hattie McDaniel's achievement was bittersweet and ultimately buried. This is the painful story of how Hollywood's racial bias ensured her greatest triumph was also her greatest humiliation. Hattie McDaniel was a trailblazer, a comedic powerhouse whose talent was undeniable. Her performance as Mammy in the 1939 epic Gone with the Wind justly earned her the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. The first crushing indignity occurred on the night of the premiere in Atlanta, Georgia. Due to the city's strict segregation laws, Hattie McDaniel was forbidden from attending the grand opening of her own film with her white castmates. The studio prioritized profit and public appeasement over the dignity of their award-winning star. The indignity continued at the 1940 Academy Awards ceremony itself, held at the segregated Ambassador Hotel. Hattie McDaniel was not allowed to sit with the other stars of Gone with the Wind at the main table. She was instead relegated to a small,
Isolated table against a distant wall, a clear visual statement of her subordinate status. Beyond these public humiliations, the studio exercised relentless control over her public image. They constantly pressured her to defend her roles, typically those of maids or servants, to civil rights organizations. She was placed in an impossible position, forced to choose between her professional survival and her community's desire for representation. Furthermore, the Academy Award did not open the door to complex leading roles. Instead, the studios maintained their discriminatory casting framework, only offering her more of the same stereotypical roles.
Her incredible achievement was immediately ghettoized. The final act of erasure came in the years following her untimely passing in 1952. The system, having limited her in life, allowed her historical moment to be overshadowed and downplayed for decades. It was a calculated effort to minimize the magnitude of her achievement. Hattie McDaniel's story reveals how the studio system's reliance on social bias could turn the highest honor in film into a painful footnote. We now turn from the cruelty of the spotlight to the systemic weapon that bound and broke so many stars, the long-term contract. Which story of betrayal, the calculated character slander of an icon, or the deliberate suppression of a talent, causes you the most shock? Comment below with your reaction to this raw truth. The studio system's forgotten contract slaves. Look at the grandeur of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer lot. But this beautiful fantasy was built upon a harsh, one-sided reality. The 7-year contract, the real weapon of erasure that effectively turned a star into a contract servant. The foundation of the Golden Age studio system was the long-term contract, a document that spanned 7 years and contained clauses that granted the studio nearly absolute power over every aspect of the actor's professional life. The actor was, quite simply, property. The power dynamic was profoundly one-sided. The studio had the right to unilaterally suspend the actor without pay for any perceived insubordination. Crucially, any time spent on suspension could be added to the end of the contract, allowing the studio to perpetually extend the 7-year term. This system was an existential threat to an actor's career independence. If an actor became dissatisfied, they were completely prevented from taking roles elsewhere. The contract acted as a golden handcuff, stifling artistic growth. The most insidious part of this arrangement was the annual option clause. Every year, the studio held the sole right to renew the contract. If the actor's box office appeal waned, the studio could simply drop the contract, an instant, unappealable dismissal. Conversely, the actor held no equivalent power. The great stars who dared to challenge this system, such as Bette Davis with her famous 1936 lawsuit against Warner Brothers, found themselves fighting a monumental battle. Most actors, lacking her power, simply submitted to the coercion. This contractual mechanism was a form of slow, administrative erasure. Careers were not ended by scandal, but by the relentless weight of a legal document that allowed studios to decide which stars would shine and which would be allowed to fade into obscurity. The lost films, when erasure is physical. Imagine history being devoured by fire or reduced to dust. The most complete act of erasure was not written in contracts or shouted in headlines, but quietly enacted in the vault. The studios destroyed the evidence, literally melting the film, a physical elimination that tried to delete history. The history of early cinema is a mosaic filled with missing pieces. This is not due to natural wear. It is, in large part, the result of a deliberate, calculated business practice executed by the major studios. Prior to the 1950s, film was seen purely as an expendable commercial product. Once a film had completed its run, the physical reels were considered costly storage items. The most shocking practice was the deliberate recycling of nitrate film for its silver content. The nitrate film base contained a measurable amount of silver. Studios could, and frequently did, melt down thousands of feet of old, unwanted film prints and negatives to recover this silver. This purely financial decision resulted in the irreversible loss of countless silent features and early sound films. This practice of physical elimination was often used against the work of actors and directors the studio was trying to erase for ideological or professional reasons. Films starring blacklisted actors were often the first to be targeted for destruction. The system's cruelty thus extended beyond the actor's lifetime. By recycling the prints, the studio not only saved storage costs, but also guaranteed that the work of the marginalized artist would become virtually impossible to screen or study. The heartbreaking result is that an estimated 80% of all American silent films are now considered lost forever. The silence around these lost films is the silence of history that the studio system actively worked to enforce. The post-war purge, when the star system collapsed. The glamour of the golden age seemed eternal, but it was built on a foundation of absolute corporate control. In the late 1940s, that foundation was irrevocably shattered by a Supreme Court decision. This is the story of the antitrust ruling that stopped the reign of the major studios and the countless stars who were left behind in the chaotic transition. For decades, the great studios controlled the film industry from top to bottom. They owned the stars through the contract, they produced the films, and crucially, they owned the theaters where those films were shown. This tight vertical integration meant the studios dictated every aspect of the American cinematic experience.
This absolute control was formally challenged in 1948 by the United States government. The legal case, famously known as the Paramount case, challenged the studio's monopolistic practice. The Supreme Court's ruling was decisive. The major studios were forced to divest themselves of their theater chains, fundamentally dismantling the entire studio system structure. The impact on the stars was immediate and devastating. Suddenly, the tightly controlled pipeline that guaranteed every contract player a steady stream of work vanished. The studios, now stripped of their guaranteed distribution network, could no longer afford to maintain enormous stables of contract players. They began a massive purge of their rosters. For many established, mid-level stars, the transition was a professional catastrophe. They were suddenly thrust into a chaotic, freelance environment where they had to fight for roles, often without the protection of the studio's powerful departments. The studios, in a final act of calculated indifference, deliberately allowed many of these established stars to fade away. Their contracts were simply not renewed. Their names were quietly scrubbed from the rolls, and their legacies were left unsupported. This was a cold, administrative dissolution, a systemic betrayal based purely on economic shifts. Robert Mitchum's reckoning. He possessed the greatest pair of sleepy eyes in the business and an air of sublime, nonchalant defiance. But the studios never trusted him, and when scandal struck, they attempted to make an example of him. How did this star resist the system they tried desperately to control, but couldn't completely suppress? Robert Mitchum was an anomaly in the polished, tightly controlled world of the Golden Age. He was rugged, charismatic, and radiated a cool, anti-establishment attitude. He was an immense talent whose films made vast sums of money, yet he refused to play the game of studio public relations. This attitude of defiant independence was seen by the studio executives as a direct threat to their authority. The ultimate confrontation arrived in 1948. Mitchum was arrested and charged with a misdemeanor for possession of unlawful substances. This was instantly amplified into a massive national scandal. The moral watchdogs and conservative press immediately called for his complete banishment. The studio, RKO Pictures, released a torrent of controlled publicity that framed the incident as the consequence of a bad boy who needed to be disciplined. They used the arrest to create a public narrative of a star whose talent was constantly at odds with his chaotic personal life, thereby justifying their need to control him. The studio pushed for his imprisonment, believing that a period of correctional time would placate the moral outrage. After he served a period of time,
The studio quickly rushed him back into production out of financial desperation. Mitchum's resilience and his continued enormous popularity were the factors that saved him from total erasure. His anti-establishment image, which the studios had tried to eliminate, paradoxically allowed him to weather the storm. Throughout the 1950s and beyond, Mitchum continued to resist the system. His career endured, but it was often undermined by the lingering narrative of his anti-establishment behavior, which executives used to keep him from the most prestigious roles. He was a survivor, but a perpetually undermined one. We have reached the end of our exploration, detailing 20 buried stories of exploitation and the system that kept them hidden. The truth, as we have seen, is far darker than any film. If you have been captivated by the secrets we've uncovered, please share this documentary with someone who loves classic Hollywood or true history. Help us ensure these stories of immense sacrifice and courage are no longer buried by the Hollywood machine. That's the hidden history of betrayal, a systemic rot that silenced icons through scandal, censorship, and cruelty. If you were shocked by the truth of Hollywood's unspoken crimes against its brightest stars, don't let their stories fade again. Like this video to help ensure these legacies are finally remembered, and subscribe to our channel so you will not miss a single story in our ongoing mission to pull back the curtain.